Hello and welcome to a very special interview here on Viking.TV with me, Anne Diamond, because I'm going to introduce you now to somebody who needs no introduction. But to give you a hint, let's have a look at this.
I've come into possession of a villa in the south of France.
What?
So what bit didn't you understand?
You're the captain now. You steer ahead.
That was a good decision.
Times change and we must change with them.
Off to the Riviera.
Whatever your secret may be, isn't it a good time to share it?
I love you in a way I thought I'd never love again.
They better be warned. The British are coming.
Well, I'll drink to that.
Downton Abbey, a new era.
It's funny because to introduce somebody who needs no introduction and to read his book, you'll realise quite what a long time and an awful lot of effort goes into becoming somebody who needs no introduction. Here's Hugh Bonneville. It's lovely to see you.
I'm very flattered by that introduction that needed no introduction.
Well, isn't it true that it seems to be a theme that goes throughout the book, that, you know, to be sitting here talking about your amazing career, it doesn't always come easy, does it?
It doesn't, and I think hindsight is a wonderful tool that we all possess. You know, you can look back and join all the dots and see a logical progression to today, to why we're sitting here. But actually, at the time, we don't know if we're turning left or right. We don't know what's going to happen after lunch. And so it's all a whole load of accidents, as well as, yes, hopefully hard work and endeavour, but really so much good fortune along the way, and just a passion for what one's doing as well. But yeah, there've been some bumps. There've been some bumps, a few bumps along the way.
Yeah, but you're not ashamed to talk about the bumps, which makes it fascinating. It's a lovely book.
Thank you.
It's a laugh out loud and also have a little cry book. If I were to say it reminds me of David Niven's writing, The Moon's a Balloon, would that be a compliment?
That would be a massive compliment. I remember that was one of the first entertainment industry autobiography, memoirs that I read, and I haven't read it for several decades, but it's always stayed with me for that very reason, that it was informative, fun, and human, very human. You could relate to this big star, David Niven, but you could really relate to the childhood stories, of course, and the people he's worked with along the way, and being honest about the profession, But also, I think the thing I liked about him was his graciousness about the work that he did, that he appreciated the good fortune he had.
You see, that's what I see in your book. I mean, I know that you've had a career as a screenwriter as well, but I didn't realise what a brilliant writer you are, because every sentence I can hear you speak.
Oh, well, that's good.
You tell it in the character that we've come to know, I think, and there are such funny anecdotes. Have you got a photographic memory? Because I can't figure out, you describe some of the scenes from early childhood with meticulous detail. Well,
I think I've got a very clear memory of childhood. I think many of us do, because I think those are our formative years. Obviously, it's where our brain is at most sponge-like and developing so rapidly and crystallising thoughts. But of course, there are some thoughts, you go back and, did I actually think that, or is it because I remember a photograph of that incident? There's a passage in here when I talk about when I was on tour with a play when I was at Cambridge and we were in Germany. And I showed the chapter to a pal of mine in that show just to check that it happened. I said, this did happen, didn't it? And so I published it, and I said, Dominic and I had digs in this place. And then another man who was in that production of Romeo and Juliet got in touch and said, I was in those digs too. There were 5 of us, don't you remember? And I'd only remembered the incident of talking to this particular American colonel who hosted us. And so the memory does play tricks. So that's why I'm very keen to call it a memoir, not an autobiography, because I think autobiography smacks of accuracy. And memoir allows the memory to play tricks on you. And you can airbrush out the stuff that perhaps you want to forget, and as I say, some things are more vivid than others, and that's just memory playing tricks. But I'm glad it comes across as my voice anyway. Yeah,
it certainly comes across as your voice, so much so that halfway through the book I thought, I wonder if he's recorded the audio book, and you have, and I got that too.
Oh, good.
I've had a mixture of the two things.
Oh, that's
actually,
great.
Which has been
well,
brilliant.
You see, of course, in the printed version you get photographs, which you don't get in the audio, but in the audio you get 2 or 3 more chapters. So.
Oh, I didn't realise that.
Yes, well worth a listen.
Oh, excellent. It's. I'm going to do what you did in the book, actually, and start, because you flit about with the timelines, and start with Downton Abbey, because that's, we've just seen, that's why so many people all over the world now know your face so well. And you start in this lovely world that most of us non-actors never see. We imagine that when you've got as important as filming something like Downton Abbey, which has been acclaimed for so long, that you would be treated like superstars when you walk in for a rehearsal. And you start with a scene that's really not superstarish at all.
Well, you mean the read-through?
Yeah.
Well, yes, I remember I wrote about the read-through for the first film, the first feature film that we did, which was a few years after we'd finished the show. And you do tend to meet in these rather unsalubrious circumstances, because there's so many of you. It has to be either be in a sort of deconsecrated church or in British film studios are fairly run down on the whole, and Ealing Studios or Shepperton, I can't remember which one it was, but they've got sort of chicken wire on the walls with what looks like asbestos billowing out, and they haven't been touched since Alec Guinness was there in the 1950s or whatever. And you're sitting around a big sort of semicircle of a trestle table, and there might be a satsuma or a manky orange. Or if you're lucky, there might be, depending on the class of production, certain degrees of coffee. You might have instant coffee if it's a theatre production, or you might get a sort of high street chain coffee if it's TV. But then if it's a film, you might even have an in-house barista. You see, it all depends.
Wow.
But I do remember gathering for the Downton Abbey read-through. And we'd been told a few days earlier that the marketing team had come up with this really funky idea of filming us while we were doing the read-through. Now, read-throughs are the most painful experience, particularly for the writers, but also for the actors, because it's the first time you're hearing it all together. And no one, you might not know each other, so one or two people might know each other. So it's a very delicate thing, and it's quite a private thing. It's a bit like being in the makeup trailer. That's also meant to be a sacrosanct area as well, where it's just a bit of privacy. And so I think it probably was Maggie Smith who, when she heard this plan of filming us, sort of said, "Oh, I don't think so." And so it was soon shut
You do
down.
that very well. Go on.
So, well, no, it's simply that the read-through was, again, one of these cold, windy experiences, but without the cameras, thank goodness. And I do remember after we started reading, and after just a few lines, just looking around the table at all my friends that we'd been part of the show for on and off for 10 years by then, or certainly 8-10 years, and just we sort of almost had a nod of the shake of the head that we couldn't quite believe that we were here again in a good way. And that this show that no one had thought, certainly in the British broadcasting industry, really thought had any legs or would survive past the first season. And here we are 6 seasons later, and now we're doing a movie. So it was a very special moment. And I have to say, just on that, when we went back to do the second movie, of course, the read-through by then was on Zoom because we were in the lockdowns,
Of course.
in the pandemic. And I have to say, when we went back to filming the second movie at Highclere, particularly at the castle, I'd always, going up that driveway every day to set was always a sort of hairs on the back of the neck. I couldn't believe this was my office, and not that we'd ever taken it for granted, but we got used to it, and we got used to the scenery and the location and all that. But I have to say, during the second film, knowing that the script was really a tonic for people emerging from lockdown, it had that sort of carefree spirit about it, and I just knew that our audience would really love it. And I really appreciated it in a way that I hadn't before, coming onto set every day and realizing how fortunate we were and how lucky we were to work as actors during the pandemic, at the latter stages of 2021 or middle of 2021. And I really appreciated Downton Abbey in a way I'd never had before, because I realized, the hundreds of messages we've had over the years of what it's meant to families, to people who maybe they were watching it with loved ones who are no longer with us and that sort of thing. It really did make an impact on people, and still now, all these years later, people are still watching it for the first time and going, "Oh, it's really good."
It's quite good. This.
So those two experiences of the read through of the first film and then the pandemic version of it, or the second film, I realised more than ever what a lucky fellow I am and how lucky we all were to do something that's become so beloved.
It's funny because when you first heard the words, I don't know if it was called Downton Abbey from the very beginning, but you bumped into Julian Fellows and just sort of more or less in small talk asked him what he was up to at the moment. And he said something about writing a period piece or something. And didn't he ask you if you would be okay being thought of as a patriarchal figure, old enough to have 3 marriageable age girls.
That's right. We were doing. In fact, he was directing me in a film called From Time to Time, which is a delightful film, with Maggie Smith playing the lead. And in fact, as it turned out, about half the cast, you can spot the Downton actor in it. This was a year prior to doing Downton. And yes, in between setups one day, I asked him, what else have you got in the works? Because, being a writer as well as a director, he always has plates spinning. And he said, I'm doing a 4-part series about the Titanic, and I'm adapting the book. And also, actually, I'm revisiting Gosford Park territory. I'm writing a show about a country house and between the wars. And he said, yes, do you think you're too old to play a dad? And I said, well, I am a dad. He said, yes, but your Felix is only about 5. Marriageable age daughters. And I said, well, I don't know, possibly, I don't know. And it went from there. But it's interesting, he talked about the country house between the wars as one of the few precincts, as they say in drama, one of the few settings where you can legitimately see a true cross-section of society, which is why so many shows are set in hospitals or in police stations. I suppose you could set them in airports, but airports are far more transitory. But it's true, you can see all walks of life in those environments. So there's a static centre, be it the police station or the hospital, or in this case the country house, which becomes the central character. And then in and out of that come people from all walks of life. And I think that again was one of the great strengths of the show, that you could invest in all these different types of people from their different backgrounds and different aspirations, but all trying to muddle along in this one place.
Yeah, somewhere I think towards the end of the book you concede that there are, who are the biggest stars from Downton? Mm-hmm. Or what is the biggest star from Downton?
Well, the biggest star is the house, is the castle. And then I think Maggie Smith a close run second.
Absolutely. And it's interesting when you see as well the span of time it's taken to make the series and then the movies. She can't have thought that she'd be there that long, and yet she too, like you, has gone all the way through it.
I know, and every year I thought she wouldn't come back, because she's, she was a woman of mature years, shall we say, even when we started. And I thought, well, she'll retire soon, or have had enough, or, this telly thing isn't for her. But bless her, she was there at the beginning of every read-through and saw it through to the end.
You do her very well. You're a bit of an impressionist, are you not? Because you tell a lovely story about when she was there and then Shirley MacLaine came on set for the first time.
Oh, that was, yes, I describe it as like Stanley meeting Livingston, these two great icons, coming together, one from the British, icon of the British industry and one of the American, and they met in the hallway at Highclere. I can remember it vividly. It was about 8 o'clock in the morning, just before rehearsals started, and it was cold, so they had on these big puffer coats, and they met right in front of the fireplace. It was a perfect two-shot. I was on the stairs watching, and they gave each other a hug, and Maggie said, have we met before? I can't remember. And Shirley said, oh, don't you remember? I can't do an American accent very well. Don't you remember it was at the Oscars 40 years ago? And she said, I was probably face down in a cake. We were backstage, so we must have been presenting. Oh, we didn't win then, and they just sort of, rattled on together for ages, and could have gone either way. They've got two great characters, two great divas, in the proper sense of the word, great icons, but they got on like a house on fire. And one of my fondest memories actually is of, and Shirley was great with the youngsters, and Michelle Dockery, who played Lady Mary, she was a really keen, a wonderful dancer herself, and of course Shirley had done these Broadway shows, and so I always remember Shirley showing Michelle and Tom Cullen, who was in the show, some Bob Fosse moves, and saying, no, you got to go from the hip, kick from the hip, it's got to go from the hip, doing all, and it was just glorious, this sense of the baton being passed on down the generations.
Of course, we all, non-actors, have always understood there's an awful lot of hanging around in filming. What do amazing women from the industry, like Dames and Shirley MacLaine, Hollywood actress, what do they have in their handbag? What do they get out the knitting in between times, or what?
Well, Judi Dench certainly has done in the past. I used to do tapestry, and Julia Roberts did. So she and I compared tatting on Notting Hill. But on Downton, the big theme was word games, and not Scrabble so much as a game called Bananagrams, which is a bit like Scrabble. They got to, but Bananagrams people got to hear that we used to play Bananagrams, which is a sort of, again, you sort of put tiles down and create words, and they have to link up and all that sort of thing. And they heard about this, so they gave us a specially produced Downton edition of Bananagrams, which was lovely. So there's a bit of that, and we'd play Wink Murder when we were on the set, when it was too tricky to get off the set while they were... Wink Murder, which is you'd put... It's daft. You just tear up bits of paper, but on one of them, say there's 8 people around a table, so you tear up 8 bits of paper, and on one of them you put a cross, so that's the murderer. And we used to put them in the mustard pot, and then while they were setting up the lights, we'd hand it round, and so you'd all take one, and then you'd carry on chatting, and then what you'd have to do, your task was, without anybody else seeing, you'd have to wink at someone, and then they had to die. You see, can you die elaborately, please? Just, you see, and so somebody thinks, right, so who's the murderer? Who's the murderer? So then you're paranoid. Who's next? And so you're watching everybody, and then gradually round the table people die until you go, j'accuse, I think it's you. I think you're the murderer, or you saw them wink or something like that. Maggie was really good at it. It was really annoying.
That is why you lot gave her, on her final shoot day, you gave her the mustard pot.
Yes, Elizabeth McGovern got her a little silver mustard pot. It was a memento, because that was
Perfect.
we played so many games of Wink Murder.
I want to do what you do in the book now, which is flash right back, because you write so vividly about some of these things, like making movies, but you also write so vividly about your own childhood. And it's so fascinating that you have emanated as Mr. Brown in Paddington, because I think your childhood was a bit Paddington-esque. I mean, there were lots of things like how circus kids used to come to your school when circus was in town, and one of them came on an elephant.
It was so exciting. I mean, in these days of health and safety and all that, they'd never be allowed these days. But the Billy Smart Circus used to come on to Blackheath, which is part of in southeast London. It's a big open expanse of grass, and then near Greenwich Park. And the circus used to come to town once a year, and for whatever it was, the month that they were there, the kids from the circus would come to our little junior school, and I never forget it. One day they arrived on an elephant. It was the coolest thing you've ever seen, down our little side street, and there they were.
And for a lot of people who aren't aware of British television, you were a huge Blue Peter fan. Now, Blue Peter, absolutely iconic BBC children's programme. So you were a very big fan of that, but also you, like most of your generation, and mine and others, you used to watch Doctor Who from behind the sofa, I think your grandma's sofa.
That's right. It was a Saturday afternoon sort of treat. It's a strange thing. It's hard to describe because the Doctor Who came on just after the football, the soccer football results, and there was this sort of sing-song tone that the results were read out in, like West Bromwich Albion 2, Leeds United 1, and it sort of went on like that, going through all the scores, and this sort of strange feeling would grow in me because I knew that it was coming to an end, and soon it would be Doctor Who. And the Doctor Who was gripping. It was a wonderful show, but there was something about the opening titles, which back in the day I remember it was a sort of diamond coming out at you from the screen, and then the face of Doctor Who would emerge. In my case, it was the first one was Patrick Troughton, and then John Pertwee, and it was thrilling and exciting but scary all at the same time. And so I literally, I hid behind the sofa of my granny's because I was deposited there on a Saturday afternoon, and had my nose just sort of up, watching the black and white telly in the corner, and getting very overexcited about it. So those sorts of memories do stay with you, don't they?
And you had an older brother and a younger sister.
Older sister as well.
Older sister as well. And you say being the irritating younger brother was written into your job description.
Yes. I basically had to annoy them. And my brother was 8 years older, and therefore sort of was away at the races almost as in my formative memories. But my sister was more around, and she was my brother had gone to boarding school. My sister was at a day school in Blackheath. And she was just annoying, I mean, that's what older sisters are when you're 5, 6, 7. So my job really was to annoy her and to kick her under the table and blame her.
But didn't you sort of wield a sledgehammer?
Yes. The sledgehammer incident is prominent.
That was Paddington-esque because you didn't hit her.
No, I didn't. I would love to have done, but what had happened was she'd done something annoying, like be a sister, and so she stuck her tongue out at me. That's what it was. She pinched my ears or something. So I chased her around the garden, and it was a square back garden. So I chased her around the perimeter, like puffing away, and she just and ran around. And then she ran back inside, and slammed the door and locked the back door. And it was a 12-paned glass back door with wooden thing with lots of different panes. And that's when she stuck her tongue out. And of course how dare you? And in slow motion, I looked, and there was a sledgehammer having a tea break by the back door, and I thought, and so I picked it up, and I can still see it, and I just launched it through the 12 panes of glass. And then cut to my dad chasing me around. But of course, it wasn't as stupid as I was. He didn't go around the perimeter. He just cut across the middle and tackled me in about 4 seconds. And I think I got the slipper that day. Anyway, but the good thing was the back door got a new sheet of glass. None of this silly 12-pane business. It got one big sheet of glass, which is much easier for Mum to clean.
You see, that's why I think you're Paddington-esque already. Because didn't you point out to your family that, yes, you'd been a naughty boy, but actually you'd let more light into
Exactly. You see, it was a much nicer kitchen after that. So I should be thanked, really.
OK, you mentioned your dad there. And again, in beautiful detail, you talk about being a little boy and waiting for him to come home in the evening, hearing him come up the stairs, and he used to come in and tell you a story, but it always started the same way.
It did. He was a surgeon, and he'd get back from hospital. And so for me, a hospital was a man in a suit who smelt strangely of sort of antiseptic or something. Only in later years did I really appreciate what his day job was. But his main job, when I was 7, 8, 6, whatever, was to come and tell me bedtime stories. And so if I was awake, and I'd jolly well make sure I was awake, I'd hear this familiar tread up the stairs and hope he'd come and tell me a bedtime story. But they always started the same way. Once upon a time, a long, long time ago, when Richmond Park was all forest, there lived in a clearing in a wood a mum and a dad, and 3 children, Niggle the Giggle, Clara Bear a Butterskin, and Hugh the Boo the Boo. And then he went on to talk about this squirrel that lived in the woods, and this squirrel was extraordinary because he kept the nuts not in his cheeks but in his ears, and so whenever he shook his head they rattled, and he had one red eye and one blue eye. And anyway, Dad started the story the same way every night, and it took me years to realise that actually he was just buying time to sort of let the hospital go and think up whatever he was going to tell the story of. And I look back with enormous gratitude and affection and admiration that he would do that for me when he'd got so much else going on.
Well, yeah, being a surgeon, he must have had a tough day already.
Absolutely, all those decisions to make and frankly, lives to save and bigger things than me and my adventures with the squirrel. But
and he was a pianist as well, wasn't he? He was a musician.
He was a wonderful pianist, and I think this is probably one of the reasons I'm a useless musician, is because I'd listen to him practice every morning before he went off to work, and beautiful Chopin or Scott Joplin or Schubert or whatever. And so then I'd start on my grade 1 piano going plink, 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 and think, why aren't I as good as Dad? And get really cross. And so I gave up fairly swiftly.
But not only was your dad a remarkable figure, but your mum was, well, you didn't realise what a remarkable figure she was until actually she died. And people came to her funeral and started to tell you stories. But, I mean, wasn't she, you just thought she was a housewife and mother.
Well, yes, I knew a little more than that, and a little more prior to her death, but not much. But really what happened was that when I was about 9, she announced that she was going to take an office job in London. So I got really cross and saying how selfish she was and how, what about my tea and all that sort of thing. And so she went off and did this job for, I don't know, 7 or 8 years, 10 years maybe. And then long after she retired, I opened the newspaper one day and there was a thing saying Secret Service building to be sold, MI6 as it was. I rang her up and I said, hang on, you worked at Century House, didn't you, Mum? Because it was the building where we used to drop Mum off at work. And she said, yes, dear. And I said, but that's MI6. Yes, dear. And I said, you used to work there. You're a spy. How exciting, you're a spy. And she said, no, dear, I did some filing. And then when she passed on, I said, and she obviously never said anything more about it, wasn't permitted to, and nor did she want to. But when she passed on, I said to my dad, did she tell you any what she did? And he said, no, never. No, she went for 3 days a week, and that was that. And then weirdly, a few days, I'd mentioned this on a radio program, and a few days later, I got a call from someone at MI6, which was a bit strange, saying, we're doing a series of lunchtime talks. Would you like to come along and do a talk about life on on Civvy Street, on the outside of what normal people do? And I think it would be nice for our the people who work here and under they can't explore the outside world in a way that others can, or talk about what they do. And so I did. So I went along, and there were 150 people in a sort of lunchtime lecture theatre, all having their sandwiches and their coffee and falling asleep. And I chatted a bit about people who'd influenced me in my career choices. And then a guy came up to me who said, I work with your mum. And for me, this was a few years after she'd passed on. And I found that suddenly a real a strange sensation, because I never knew about her work or the details of it. And this man said, I was a young chap when I joined, and your mum was in charge of our section, and we'd be sitting there doing the crossword, and suddenly we'd hear these footsteps on the passageway coming. I'd go, quick, that's Pat, and we'd have to jump to it and look lively and do what we were doing. And it was just the description of the way that she walked that suddenly had this amazing resonance with me, because I remembered those footsteps. I hadn't thought of them for years, and then the way that she walked when she was on a mission, had a purpose. I suddenly could hear and I could see the sorts of shoes she wore, and I could hear the footsteps on the linoleum passageway, and I was connected suddenly to this man. And he hadn't seen her for 20 years, and she'd passed away 5 years before or whatever it was, and I found that really emotional. And then at the wake, yes, MI6 said it was allowed to be known in the funeral that she'd worked for this particular section. And I think she had done filing, but it was of a pretty sensitive nature. Mm-hmm. And my sister came up to me at the wake afterwards and said, there's several people from the service here, from the Secret Service. And I said, really? And 2 of them live in the valley, in Mum and Dad's village. And I said, you're kidding me. And she said, yeah, her over there, and then Derek over there. I said, Derek's the quietest bloke on the planet. What are you talking about? She said, well, yeah, he's the most discreet bloke you'd ever meet. And I had this memory of Mum and Derek sitting in corners at sort of village events, be it after the church service or the fundraiser or whatever, and see them nattering away, and I think, oh, she's got stuck with Derek again. And but in fact, they were just having a good old office
gossip. What were they nattering
Yeah,
about?
they were just
Wow.
having a bitch about work.
And your brother, you tell lovely stories about how, luckily, I think, you lived in a house that had a big dressing up box, and you did put on little plays. And your brother and sister were also pretty good at that, weren't they?
Absolutely.
But they didn't go into it professionally. You did. Where did you get that bug from?
I don't know. I think a lot of it is being the spoiled youngest, to be honest. When my brother and sister were growing up, my parents, they encouraged their engagement with the arts. All of us. That was a wonderful privilege of my background. The arts were just there. We went to endless museums and blooming country houses, and bored the crap out of me. But actually, it was in retrospect, I'm incredibly grateful because it was just I call it this sort of low-level hum of culture with a small c was there in my upbringing, and I'm enormously privileged and conscious of how lucky I was. But my brother, when he left, by the time he left school, he loved acting and loved it all through his life. But it was never going to be a professional possibility. I think my parents would have been panicked because they obviously needed to be there as some sort of cushion support, emotional if not financial, and precarious profession. Plus, they knew nothing about the business. It's medicine was their thing. And my brother went off and became an insurance broker, and then my sister went and joined the Foreign Office initially, and then went into banking. And so by the time I came along, I think they were just relieved that the other 2 had gone off and got sensible jobs. And so when I, the flibberty gibbet said, I think I'd like to have a go at acting, and I'm sort of set on it actually, and I'm going to give myself 3 years to get my equity card, which was the union ticket you needed in those days. And to my, not amazement, but to my delight, they said, well, we're right behind you. We've seen you act. And by then I'd done quite a lot of school plays. And
Well, yeah, because I want to bring you back to the letter, the turning point.
Yeah.
You talk about it. And you still look back and wonder what your life would have panned out to be had you not got the letter.
Yeah.
Tell us what the letter was.
Well, I auditioned when I was 16 for the National Youth Theatre because, let's face it, at school, some kids are in the school play because they're in detention, frankly. Johnson, you've been mucking about again, go and hold a spear in the school play. And so, I loved doing school plays. I couldn't wait to audition. There were kids who were waiting for the school team to be put up, the football or the cricket team to be put up each week, and I'd be waiting to see for the audition list, And but it wasn't for everyone. And so the National Youth Theatre is an organisation that brings kids from all over the country, all over the British Isles together in London. In those days, it was just over the summer, to put on plays and to be treated with a sort of professional discipline about putting on plays. And you learn, all sorts of stagecraft, etc. And it was just wonderful to be with kids who wanted to put on plays non-stop and full stop. But also, it was my first real social broadening in terms of I started meeting kids from all walks of life, and realised again how fortunate I'd been with this backdrop of comfortable middle-class life in southeast London, being exposed to the arts, whereas so many of my colleagues now had none. They literally, some didn't even have a book in the house, And I think that's where it sort of sunk into me, what a responsibility I had, and I have now, to support young people in the arts who haven't had the
So
opportunity.
the letter was...
So the letter, sorry.
Sorry, the letter was, basically saying...
So the letter was, having auditioned for the National Youth Theatre, the letter was saying, you've got in. And I can remember, again, it's these moments in life where you look. I can remember the moment I opened the letter, I could see the postmark and this familiar headed notepaper saying your application's been successful. And I wonder if it and I bumped into people since who've said that their letter said unsuccessful. Mm-hmm. Again, it's these left and right turns you have in life. If I'd not had that experience, would I have had the confidence to carry on in exploring theatre, which still at that stage was not a professional opportunity for me. It was just a hobby. And I wonder if I would have then, at university, said, actually, I do want to have a go at drama school, or whether I would have gone down the path of law, which I thought I was going to do.
Why did you go to university to read theology?
Because I had at school one of those teachers who just made theology fascinating. And I'm sure so many of your viewers will recognise that, where a subject comes alive because of one teacher. Mm. And I had this teacher who blew in like a breath of fresh air in my senior years at school, and the New Testament became fascinating. I'm not a person of faith, but the Bible as literature, or the Bible as a series of stories that have come together because of people's need for faith, I completely am absorbed by it. The Old Testament too, and the way that that's been constructed over the centuries and millennia. But the New Testament, and particularly the Gospels, I found riveting. There's something called the synoptic problem, which I got really excited about. It's why Matthew, Mark, and Luke are very similar but very different. And why does Matthew have the arrival of the kings at the Nativity but no shepherds, and why does Luke have shepherds but no kings? That sort of thing. So you begin to understand about editorializing and how stories are, however pure your sense of journalism may be, as soon as you start editing, then you're starting to influence the original source material. And if Mark was the oldest gospel, then why have Matthew and Luke, and then later John, which has got a whole new sort of gloss on the whole thing, gone in different directions? Who was their audience? Who were they trying to influence? Who was Saul, Paul? So all that sort of side I found really interesting, but as literature, not as a source of faith for in my case.
But while you were at Cambridge studying that, it sort of gave you a thirst for travel, didn't it? You wanted to go to India. You went to Calcutta and found it very shocking.
I did. I had this extraordinary experience. This was actually just before I went to Cambridge. In my year between school and university, I went off to explore some mad theory I had about the Sudanese tribes, which was my theology teacher had said, go on and look at it. Again, it was one of those encouraging teachers who just said, however bonkers your idea, there may be something in it. Well, there wasn't, but I had a go. But I did end up actually in Calcutta, which of course is an extraordinary melting pot. And I was travelling with someone who didn't want to stay in the youth hostel, so she had a contact in this incredibly grand sort of country house estate club, and with sort of swirling sprinklers and bougainvillea and everything. It was bonkers, and yet you come out the gates and there is this extraordinary poverty and subsistence level existence, and it taught me a lot about privilege and trying to help your fellow man.
You did get your degree. You got a Desmond.
I got a Desmond 2-2, yes, a Desmond 2-2, yeah. I got a third in my part one, so it was a bit of an
well, you did quite well.
But that was really because I was doing so many plays. I'm now ready to go to university, I always say that.
Oh, yes, I think, aren't we all? It's wonderful. So at that stage, you sort of came out. You came out of the closet, as it were.
I came out of the dressing up box, the closet.
Yeah, that's right. And told your parents, I want to pursue acting, and
yeah.
they supported you.
They were very supportive, and I often wonder, if they'd said, "Don't be ridiculous," you said you were going to go and after you'd done theology that you were going to go and do law. I wonder if would have had the courage to say, "Well, stuff it, I'm off to," would I've run off and joined the circus, because their support, as you've gleaned, was incredibly important to me, and their kindness towards myself and my brother and my sister, their nurturing was non-stop. And I think I might have found it hard to say, well, damn you, I'm off. But I suppose I possibly knew that they were going to support any of us in whatever way we went emotionally, and when it was for us to make our own mistakes and So that's why I
I mean, it wasn't easy. You tell the story of doing this play, doing that play, being rejected at that audition, whatever. I mean, the audition sequences are mind-blowing. But you say when you went to the National Youth Theatre that first time, you felt you'd found your tribe. When you got to the RSC and the National, you felt home.
I did really, yes. The tribe was finding my like-minded, fellow actors, and then really going to, I suppose, the National first, the National Theatre in London on the South Bank, which has 3 theatres, and I was only playing, I didn't even have any lines. I was just an understudy, so in effect, I was sort of watching from the sides. But I learned so much there. Because of the 3 theatres, I was able to pop into the wings of the other theatres in my acres of time.
You've got a lovely passage in the book. Can I ask you to read it?
Yeah.
Which is when you're at the National, and you just get a flavour of, and you impart that flavour of how exciting it must have been just hovering in the wings.
Oh,
sometimes.
yeah. So you have a backstage, of course, you have a tannoy system that announces what's the 3 different theatres, and they had staggered start times. So you had the Olivier Theatre always started at 7:15, the Cottesloe at 7:30, and then the Littleton at 7:45. Each evening, 3 companies of actors preparing for shows in 3 different theatres with 3 different audiences. I was in a great big dressing up box, and even though I barely featured in the stories being told, I loved being part of it all. At 6:40 p.m, the first of the evening's tannoy announcements will be broadcast backstage. Olivier Theatre, good evening ladies and gentlemen of the King Lear, or Small Family Business, or Anthony and Cleopatra Company. This is your half-hour call. Half an hour, please, thank you. Followed 15 minutes later by Cottesloe Theatre, good evening ladies and gentlemen. And then at 7:10 p.m, Littleton Theatre, good evening. With each theatre's 1/4, 5 and beginners' calls singing out as the clock counted down, the sense of mounting anticipation was palpable. 3 ships preparing to leave harbour. 7:15 p.m, the hushed tones of the DSM, the Deputy Stage Manager. Olivier Theatre, lights up on Act 1. 7:30 p.m, Cottesloe Theatre, lights up. 7:45 p.m, Littleton Theatre. And off they'd sail on a cruise to distant lands of the imagination. Docking a few hours later, the passengers would disembark and the crews would gather in the backstage bar to swap stories of that particular voyage's adventures and mishaps. So it's very appropriate for a cruise channel.
It is actually, isn't it? I hadn't thought of it. But that sounds so exciting. To a young man sort of trying to make it in the business, it must have been absolutely exciting.
It was. I was just a little minnow in this big pond, and of actors I respected and continue to respect. People like, when I was there holding my little spear, there was Anthony Hopkins and Judi Dench and Michael Gambon and a wonderful company of actors who came and went, and I just learned really by osmosis, started to learn my craft.
Wasn't there one play that you were in where you were not on very much at all, and you had some sort of abscess in your tooth, and you actually, while the play was going on, you went to the dentist's and came back?
Yeah, this was a few years later. This was at the Royal Shakespeare Company when Kenneth Branagh was playing Hamlet and I was playing Laertes, and it was the 3rd preview. We opened it at the Barbican Theatre in London, and it was a matinee. And I woke up that morning with this throbbing tooth. It was agony. And I went in to do we did the fight rehearsal at whatever it was, noon. And Ken was saying, you all right? I said, no, all right. And anyway, by the time I got on stage, and Laertes has a chunk at the beginning and then acres of time off, and then comes on towards the end, and as things spiral out of control for Hamlet and the denouement. And we were doing a full-length production, so only about one line had been cut. So there was this huge, as I say, huge gap in the middle, like nearly 2 hours, I think. And so I came off after my first scene, and I was sweating like anything. And I said to the stage manager, and so luckily the production was set in Edwardian time, so I had a sort of vaguely modern costume. I mean, it was a suit, didn't look crazily out of place. So that was in my favour, and so I jumped in a cab, and because of this big time off in the middle, the stage manager took the gamble that I was going to be back in time. So I arrived at this hospital in East London, going, and the guy said, oh yes, I can see you've got a nasty thing going on there, so what we'll do is we'll put a little injection in, numb you up. I said, no, you can't numb me, I've got to go back on stage in an hour. And so he put a lot of cloves in, and it was pretty ugly, and did some prodding and stuff. And I came back, and I was just, as I say, I had this temperature on, and came back and just couldn't wait for Hamlet to kill me by the end, you know, just virtually I just stabbed myself. And all through the last few scenes, I remember Ken, who knew none of this really, so looking at me strangely as I was ranting and raving, but I was sort of doing it sotto voce. And I was very calm and very still because I just didn't have the energy to do any of my usual acting. And so the sword fight was a bit, it was like handbags, and I died mercifully. And then, unbeknown to me, a great friend of mine was watching the matinee, and he came round afterwards. He said, "Hugh, I've seen you in so many shows, but that was the best performance I've ever seen you give. I mean, you were so still and so controlled." I thought, oh, all right.
Give me another anaesthetic.
Yeah.
You talk a lot about, I mean, you've got wonderful anecdotes, I mean, including when your Achilles tendon snapped while you were on stage. I mean, But you point out some of these big names that you came across, eventually worked with, but their generosity. There was one lovely scene, you talk about how Judi Dench gave you the stage at one point.
It was my first play with her at the National Theatre, and it was an ensemble production. So there were, you know, we were all playing different parts. But Judy and an actor called Tim Pigott-Smith were playing the two leads, and it was and Sir Peter Hall, who ran the National Theatre, was a famous theatre producer in Britain, and he was directing, and I was this new boy, you know, I was 24 or so, and I was standing waiting to come on in my first rehearsal with Judy, and my script was literally wobbling in my hands, and Judy, you know, finished the scene with Tim, and he went off, and I stepped on, and she could see my nerves. She saw something anyway, and she did, and what she did was she turned her back to the audience and stepped down stage. So basically, she was at the front of the stage, but with her back to the audience. So she literally gave me the centre stage where she had been standing. And it was about the most generous thing an actor could do. It was a sort of subtle way of saying, "Don't worry, the stage is yours." You know.
Gosh.
Whereas, you know, lesser actors would have sort of, you know, walked up stage and made me look small.
Yeah, but you mentioned the generosity of quite a few, like Michael Gambon, very generous, and of course you mentioned Kenneth Branagh. He became a great mate, didn't he?
Well, he became certainly a great mentor. Yes, and I only realised this actually when I was writing the book, that he became a sort of fulcrum in the transition between my doing theatre and film. I never thought I'd do film, and in fact, when I was doing the Hamlet with him, I chided him almost for running away from theatre and going off to make movies. I said, you know, but theatre's so important. And he said, yeah, but if I'd put Hamlet on screen, millions of people will see it. If I do it on stage, we might get 100,000. You know. And you know, our production or his production that I was in was a sellout. But you know, if he went on to make, you know, movies like Much Ado About Nothing, which is a beautiful adaptation, and of course Hamlet. But yes, he became influential to me because we used to do our fight rehearsals every day. We'd have a bit of a catch up about what was going on, and he was in pre-production for Frankenstein at the time. And he also commissioned me to write a screenplay. It didn't actually come to anything in the end, but he was incredibly instrumental in giving me the confidence to write. And he said, "Have you been in any movies?" And I said, "No, never." And he said, "Well, look, why don't you come and be in Frankenstein? I've got this, you know, tiny little part, but at least you'll get to see what a film set's like, and you'll get to learn about it and learn what works in terms of writing and so on." So he was really remarkably generous to me, and so that was his Frankenstein. My one line in Frankenstein was my first film.
So it went on. I mean, and then Downton Abbey's happened, and you mentioned during the filming of Downton Abbey, they did release you to do quite a few films as well, which we've subsequently come to know you so well by. For instance, I think when you were in Downton Abbey, they did release you to do Monuments Men.
That was an extraordinary story and a great bit of good fortune again. And then I received this letter saying, the script and the covering letter and it mentioned that the dates would be in the spring of the following year. And I said, well, there's no way I can do it because I'm committed to Downton Abbey. It so happened that my American agent was also Julian Fellowes' agent, and Julian Fellowes being the writer-creator of Downton Abbey. And he said, and Julian heard about this, and he heard it was in the cast, and it was George Clooney and Bob Balaban was one of the members of the cast. And Bob Balaban had given Julian the break because he co-produced Gosford Park, and it was Gosford Park that got Julian Fellowes the Oscar, which sort of released the rest of his writing career, if you like, and certainly was the seed for Downton Abbey. So Julian said, I want to make this work. I know how important these breaks can be, and I'm incredibly grateful to Bob and, you know, the serendipity of it all. And so he very kindly, basically, I think it's in season 4 or 5, he wrote me out. I go off to America to do some issue, to solve some family problem, and come back at the end of the next episode in order that there was a 3-week chunk they needed me on Monuments Men particularly. So I'm immensely grateful to Julian for that. And funny enough, on the set of Monuments Men, I was talking to George about this. And
George Clooney?
George Clooney, sorry, George Clooney. Lest we forget. Yes. And he said that when he was doing ER, he made something like 30 films, because his character was always popping back to Chicago or wherever, or, down south to see a relative.
So he understood.
So he completely got it. And in fact, I've always found along the way, particularly obviously in the filming world, that producers are incredibly generous at trying to make things fit, things because their whole life is problem solving and solving logistics, and so I was immensely grateful to them.
So presumably it was the same while you were filming Downton. You had to negotiate to do Paddington.
Well, Paddington was sort of actually was less of a problem because it filmed at a different time of year, but there was a show I was doing called 2012, which was all about, it was a comedy set against the Olympics. And that literally was dovetailing with both projects. So one was based at the Olympic Park or near the Olympic Park in the East End of London, and one was obviously at Highclere Castle. So I was literally zipping up and down the motorway every other day. It kept me on my toes anyway.
I'll bet, yeah. Paddington, you are the perfect Mr. Brown. And I say that as somebody who grew up with Paddington and I love him to bits. You too loved Paddington as a boy.
Absolutely, yeah. The Paddington was, I think it was special for me because it was probably the first set of stories I could read for myself, and therefore it was my possession. It wasn't being read to me, I could read him. And therefore his voice was in my head and the adventures he got up to. So I was very nervous when they said they're going to make a movie of Paddington.
Yeah, because you desperately didn't want them to spoil it.
Well, you don't want to spoil it, and there've been TV iterations in the past, but this was the first going to be live action. And you thought, they're going to make a mess of it. And but then I remember reading the first page and laughing out loud. It was a description of this explorer going through the jungle. I carried with me a modest timepiece, and you see a grandfather clock being carried through the jungle. And I thought, I'm in safe hands here.
They got it dead right.
They got it. They did, and I think even with the second one, arguably even better, because the spirit of Michael Bond is there. And
yes, that's right. Of course, you knew him. You worked.
Yeah, he was in the. He appears as a beautiful little cameo in the first Paddington film, where he's there as Paddington's going through London for the first time, looking out the taxi window. And he sees an elderly gentleman at a cafe with a glass of red wine who just raises his glass, which is so sweet.
That's Michael Bond.
That's Michael Bond, and he passed away on the final day of shooting of the second film. Actually, he was 94, I think, in his 90s anyway. So he'd had a remarkable innings, and yet the Paddington stories, first written in, was it 56, 58? He was writing them to the end. He was a prodigious output. But there's something about Paddington and his relationship with London that just resonates, I think. And I think I think I've distilled it down into the fact that we've all been Paddington at some stage in our lives. We've all been the bear at the new school, coming to a strange place where we need the hand of friendship. And so you, on the one hand, as a viewer or as a reader, you want to protect him, but you admire his spirit of inquiry. He never does anything with malice. He always gets into scrapes, but they're not out of malice. They're just through out of inquiry and wanting to help. And then always things resolve and they're okay in the end. But there's always a sense of the outside, the orphan, the refugee, looking for friendship and being given friendship by the Browns and by society.
Please look after this bear.
Please look after this bear. Yeah.
It's absolutely charming. It must have been wonderfully fun to do.
It was. It was technically tricky.
Well, yes.
Working with the bear, he doesn't come out of his trailer much, but it was good fun.
Yeah. In the book, you've got lots of pictures of rather famous people in rather extraordinary circumstances with a Paddington bear with them. What's all that about?
Oh, there was, after we made the first film, Studio Canal, who are the producers of the movie, they wanted to sort of keep the spirit of Paddington alive while they were editing, because obviously, most of the work, particularly on the first one when they were exploring how the bear looked, was hundreds and hundreds of people working on digitizing the bear. And so I think they sent a memo around saying, we'd love pictures of Paddington in wherever he's been this year. And we'll send a case of champagne or a bottle of wine or something to the best entries. So I then slavishly, always one for a competition, I took him everywhere with me, my little Paddington. I got him in the cockpit of a 747 or whatever it was, and got him on a sun lounger in Ibiza, and I got all the Monuments Men people to hold him up at the premiere, and I got him all over the place, and including in Richard E. Grant's wine glass in
Yes.
Downton Abbey. Yeah.
Yeah. Did you win the bottle of champagne? Because apparently that was the prize.
That was the prize. That was the prize. I certainly got that. I think they gave me. I think they got fed up with my entries, so they just gave me a bottle of wine to shut me up. I entered so many.
From when you did the movie Iris, you were the only star in the cast on the big posters and everything who hadn't won an Academy Award, and you write a whole chapter about when your name is above the line or below the line. How does it feel now to have so many awards? They probably fall off your mantelpiece.
Well, actually, I haven't got any. I don't think I've got any. Well, I might have a couple, but no, I've been nominated lots of times,
Right.
but I'm always the bridesmaid. So one day maybe that'll change. But no, on Iris, that was my first lesson in billing. In fact, I'm not on the poster. And
Not at all?
Not at all. No. This is a film about Iris Murdoch and her final years, but it also cuts back to when she and her husband first met. So Kate Winslet and I play the characters as younger people, and Jim Broadbent and Judi Dench play them as the elder couple. And it was a big argument about, not argument, it was just a fait accompli that there were 3 names above the title and that's it. And I was a complete unknown. So to the extent that when it came to publicising the film, several journalists thought that Jim Broadbent played both the older and the younger, which we both took as a compliment.
Actually, yeah, well, and you do look remarkably similar in it. I mean, it's very, very credible. You say that watching Kate Winslet do one of the scenes in Iris is something you tell all drama students whenever you talk to them now, because she was able to do it in different ways, got more and more into character, and then you just say it was an absolute lesson watching her.
It really was. There's a scene in which young Iris tells young John, me, about the boyfriend she's had in the past, because my character's very sort of emotionally or sexually naive, and she's very experienced, and so she decides to, because she's really loves John, she decides to tell him all about the men in her life, one of whom died in the war and had proposed to her, and she'd turned him down, and of course that is a source of, if not regret, then certainly consternation that this man had gone off to battle and died, and she'd not given her heart to him. And so she gives this speech. It's probably, 30, 40-second speech. And on the first take, when the cameras were on her, on the first take, she got very emotional about this memory of this man. And it was terribly moving. And Richard Eyre, the director, was about to say cut, and she said, keep the cameras going. Could makeup come in, please? And they came in and they sort of, dabbed away the tears and put any powder back on. And she went back to the top of the speech and did it all again. This time, she completely suppressed any emotion, with the idea being that the character was on top of it, had controlled it, but there was something in her eyes. You could tell that she knew that she'd, if not missed an opportunity, but at least that it was of concern to her. And again, it was utterly powerful. And then Richard Eyre again was about to go cut, and she said, keep it going, and she went back to the top of the speech again and did it yet another way. This time you could see that the emotion bubbling up as she talked about this lost lover, and then she pushed it back down, but maybe there was a little hint of a tear in the eye or something like that. Anyway, we went cut. He eventually went cut, and he said, well, which one do I choose? I don't know which one do I choose? And the boss of BBC Films was there that day, and he said, if I could take that tape and show it to every drama student in the country, and this is one of her great skills, like any great actor, just this ability to inhabit the character so totally that there are different, as we have in life, we can walk through a door in a million different ways and say the same, we can say hello in a million different ways, and they can mean the same thing, but they have different import. And that's what she did with that speech, and it was a real lesson to me about screen acting.
There's so much in your book. I could ask you many more questions, but frankly, people ought to go and buy the book really, if they want to hear any more stories. But how do you relax at all away from the business? I know you work a lot with the South Downs National Trust. Is that a particular passion?
Well, it is. Well, just frankly, the open air and being. I live down in the towards the south coast of England, near the South Downs, which are in West Sussex, which is God's own county, and but there is something about being up on the open expanse of the hills and being able to look out across a sort of carpet of green and down towards the sea on the other side, and to hike along there. There's a wonderful walk called the South Downs Way, which is 100 miles from Winchester to Eastbourne, and I did that not in one sitting, but I did it over several days with some pals. And there's nothing like going for a hike with mates and one's dogs and just chewing the fat.
Oh, I've got to ask you about dogs. Downton Abbey, of course, famous for its dogs. Wasn't always the same dog, though, was it?
No, well, after the first season, we had this slightly lumpy dog called Rolly, playing Pharaoh, the dog, who really, like actors, only worked for food and had no personality at all. Just you'd sort of, hello, Rolly, hello, you go, mm-hmm. And had no interest at all. And the only reason that he walks obediently down my side in the first scene when Lord Grantham comes down the staircase is because I got chipolatas in my hand. And
is that true?
It's absolutely true, yeah. And every suit I had bits of chipolata somewhere when there was a dog.
So the dog would faithfully follow you.
Yeah. That's the only thing he was interested in. And so it came to the beginning of season 2, and this I was about to go on set, and Julian Fellows. I was chatting to Julian Fellows, who happened to be there that day, and this the runner came along with the dog, and he said, "Here's Pharaoh, and they're ready for you on set." And I looked at the dog, and this thing was going with its tail wagging like that, and going. I said, "This isn't the same. This isn't Pharaoh. It's called Pharaoh." I said, "It can't be called Pharaoh. This is half the size, and it's keen, and it's wagging, and it's And said, "No, it is. They're ready on set. Can you just get on set?" I said, "Also, this one's a bitch." And oh, is it? I said, "Yes, I think people will notice." And so we then on the spot had to come up with a new name because I referred to it in the scene, and so that's where. We came up with the name Isis, which of course was, as anyone who knows Egyptology will know, that Isis and Osiris were two great god and goddess. And of course Isis then in later years took on a horrible new meaning. Yeah. But we did have several Isises over the years, and then latterly a Thea. You
also organised a premiere of Downton on the International Space Station, didn't you? What was that about?
That was amazing. There was someone you and I know, Carol Vorderman, is very much into her space exploration and aeronautics and so on. And she'd asked me years ago, would I do a message for someone who worked at NASA? And it came to several years later, which I did. And then several years later, I wanted to visit NASA as part of a road trip my family and I were doing. And so I got in touch with Carol and I said, "Do you think your friend who's there would show me around a bit?" And so sure enough, that happened. And we got a sort of backstage pass, if you like, and got to be by the vast swimming pool where the International Space Station model is. So they train in the water of this vast tank about what they will do up in space. And one chap who was getting into his it took about two hours plus to get into the spacesuit to be, everything wired up and all that. And so we were chatting on the side of the big swimming pool, and he was called Bob Farmer Hines. Cut to again a couple of years later, and we'd stayed in touch a little bit, and he said, "I'm actually going up on the next crew to the ISS." And I said, "Oh, good luck." And he said, "I'm sorry, I see you've got your film coming out soon, so I'll miss that, but I'm really sorry, maybe I'll see it when I get back." Anyway, the next thing I know, he texts me from space, and he's saying, "Hey, it's a great view up here." I couldn't believe it.
You from space?
Yeah, he sent me a message from space saying, "Hey, we're over South America at the moment. It looks so cool." And I was going, "I can't believe this. This is amazing." And he said, "How's the film going?" And so I thought, well, hang on, maybe we could do something. It was about to be the premiere in America, and so we made various phone calls up the food chain. And they got the film beamed up to the ISS.
That is quite something.
And so it was great to think that we had a premiere in space or a screening.
You've been
in
all
space.
over, haven't you? When I said you're globally famous, it's even more than that, isn't it?
Fame.
Yeah. Right, we have some questions from our viewers. From Susan in Bournemouth. Did you enjoy Hollywood? Because I don't think you did terribly, did you?
I love visiting Hollywood. I've been very fortunate to visit both for work and some friends have living there. But I went to do a show that didn't go very successfully, and in fact I do write about that in the book.
You do.
I made great friends on that show. Don't get me wrong, but the system, the way that the cruelty and the hard-nosedness of Hollywood, I didn't relish hugely. I don't think I could live there permanently. No.
It's interesting you say that, because from Peter and Linda Martin in Oslo, "Thanks for all your work. We are Paddington fans, but watching years of Downton has made us feel a sense of home since we live out here in Norway now. Would you live anywhere other than Britain?"
I think I probably would. Having said I wouldn't live in Hollywood, there are certain parts of America I love. I love the northeast coast. I think as a kid, I think I'm probably being influenced by my visits to New Hampshire there. But I've always dreamt of France and somewhere in Central Europe perhaps. But I think at the moment, soggy West Sussex in England with the South Downs nearby, that'll do.
Well, it sounds like work is too busy at the moment anyway. From a Paddington Bear lover in Edinburgh, what did you think of Paddington and the Queen?
Oh, well, that was very special indeed. I had a call, in fact, I had an email a couple of weeks before from one of our Paddington producers about something else, and she said, "Oh, by the way, I can't say anything in an email. In fact, I can't say anything anyway. But anyway, Paddington's going to be doing something quite soon." And so I rang her up. I said, "You can't leave me like that. You can't drop that hint." And then she said, "I can't tell you. I can't tell you about what's happening on the Queen's Jubilee." And, I said, "What can't you tell me about what's not happening at the Queen's Jubilee?" Anyway, eventually she said, "Oh, it's so exciting. Paddington met the Queen." And it was again an extraordinary synchronicity of emotions, wasn't it? Because she was such a good sport, and it was such a beautiful little sketch.
She got it, didn't
she? Got it superbly. Got the joke. And her wit was just supreme.
Apparently, her timing. Professional actor, her timing was absolutely spot on.
Amazing. And I talked to some of the crew afterwards who said how wonderful she'd been, because big trade secret, the bear isn't necessarily there in the room, and so she had to work with all the devices that we did, but she was just spot on. And then of course that became such a key image of the Jubilee when she passed on, and the bears, little toy bears, were left at so many palace gates around the nation as a tribute. And then there was a rather beautiful thing that happened just in the autumn, in the fall, when the Queen Consort, her people, got together all the bears that had been left at the palaces and had them cleaned up, and the Queen Consort presented them to Bernardo's, the children's charity. And so we went along, and with Michael Bond's daughter and myself and Maddie, who plays Judy in the films, and we read some Paddington stories to these Bernardo's children, and Her Majesty handed out the bears, to the next generation, and the little label says, signed by Camilla, please look after this.
Oh, good on her.
So that was wonderful. It was a wonderful sort of full circle, resonating back to Her late Majesty, who'd been such a, these two national treasures, Her Majesty and Paddington.
Well, totally. Jennifer Gammon from Horsham says, can we look forward to a Paddington 3?
Well, I hope so. It's been announced that it's going to be called Paddington in Peru, which I think gives you a clue. I think it might be a visit to the home for retired bears.
In Lima.
In Lima, it was certainly the mechanics are grinding on, but it's been awfully tricky. Obviously the pandemic had a big impact, but fingers crossed. If all things go well, it'll be filming next year. So it'll be filming in the spring, summer of 23, and therefore would be out sometime in 24, I think.
Yeah. Oh, I'm glad about that. Another quick one on Downton. What was it like having Maggie Smith as a mother?
Well, funnily enough, I had lunch with her only this week, and I hadn't seen her since we'd filmed the second film, and I ended up sitting next to her. I hadn't realised that I was being placed next to her at this lunch, and so we had a couple of hours over lunch, and we just nattered about this and that. And it was probably the longest social engagement I'd had with Maggie in the 12 plus years I had calling her mum. So it was really wonderful, because when you're on set, you either got wigs or makeup and costume pulling at you, or you're only there for half the time she is, or whatever. But having her as the mother figure in that show was remarkable. I mean, talk about having to raise your game when you're on set, because she's very hard on herself, and a woman of senior years, but absolutely on it. And frustrated with herself when she didn't get it right, and all that. And so everybody was on, wanting to bring the best game to the table. And
in her death scene, there was a gesture from her that you didn't expect.
I know. It was. I realised in the death scene. Spoiler alert: she dies in number 2. Sitting by the bed there, and we were just beginning to do the day's filming. And she did something she'd never done before. She reached out and she touched my hand, and she just gave it a little squeeze. And in all the 12 years, I don't think we'd ever touched. It was really strange. And she touched me and she gave me a little squeeze. And after that, no acting required.
No. And James asked a question which looks forward, I suppose, to other things, other movies. How does it feel being a bad guy at last in your latest movie?
Well, I've done a few bad guys over the years, but I suppose this one really landed because it was a Netflix film called I Came By. It's a wonderfully clever script by a wonderful Iranian-born director, Babak Anvari, and the film starts off going in one direction. You think, oh, I've got a handle on this. This is about these, this is about this, and then suddenly it goes, and takes you off in a completely different direction. And all is not what it seems. I don't want to spoil it for people, but
No.
but I've had some I've had some angry messages saying you shouldn't play people like him. You should play people with Labradors and bears. It's not, you shouldn't play nasty people. Anyway, it was fun.
Yeah.
The devil has the best tunes.
Well, look, I could go on all day asking you more questions, but the basic lesson, I think, from speaking to you just now is if anyone wants to hear any more, they should actually get the book or the audiobook, which is absolutely brilliant as well. And as you say, has 2 extra chapters.
Yeah.
Playing under the piano is basically just because that's where you used to play when you were a little boy.
Sort of, yeah. Yes, I've just got a very strong image of memory of being at my nursery school, being under the piano in the upright piano in the corner of the classroom, and not being sure if I should come out into the spotlight where the teacher wanted me to do something, and I was happier under the piano with my toys. And so that's tension of being, actually, I'm not a hugely extrovert person, and actually finding that the playing with the toys under the piano is where you're meant to do it, and not out in the spotlight. That's for, don't show off, that's showing off.
Well, we're all glad you did come out from under the piano. It's been absolutely riveting, as is the book, as is the audiobook. I've had such fun listening to it. And finally, I did want to ask you about your father, because you lost him, and you lost him very slowly. But he would be very proud of you, wouldn't he now?
Well, I always think of that final image in the film Babe. My family weren't very demonstrative, but when Farmer Hoggett looks down at the pig and says, "That'll do, pig, that'll do." It's that sort of, quiet pride, I think. He was a man of great wisdom, great twinkle in his eye, but his journey with dementia was a slow one, but a benign one. We were very fortunate it was a benign one, and actually it was a great honour to write about him in the book.
Well, thank you for doing so.
Thank you.